To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them, to die, to sleep no more, and by a sleep to say, we end the heartache and a thousand natural shocks that flesh is heir to. 'Tis a consummation devoutly to be wished, to die, to sleep perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub, for in that sleep of death what dreams may come. William Shakespeare. To be or not to be. Hi, hello, and welcome again everybody to another episode of Natural Juan. This time around we're going to discuss Richard Matheson's What Dreams May Come, which was later adapted to film by Vincent Ward and starring the late Robin Williams and Annabella Sciorra. I was actually planning to include this in a discussion involving Richard Matheson's other works, such as I Am Legend, Real Steel, which was just steel in the original story, and Hell House, which became The Legend of Hell House in its film adaptation. Thing is, I think that this particular novel and film adaptation deserved its own video due to the scope and meaning of the overall work. I mean, adding it in with all the other works of Richard Matheson would just cause a conflict with their themes. Also, while I've discussed many other authors such as Stephen King, Dean Koontz, Brian Keene, H.P. Lovecraft, and William Hope Hodgson, and this will be my first time delving into the works of Richard Matheson, so let this be his epic entrance into my channel. And boy, is it an entrance indeed. Anyway, before we proceed, I'd like to take the time to acknowledge our sponsor, Dermhaven. Even if the stresses of life put you through hell and back, I'm sure the attention of Dr. Rochelle Pineda can fix some of that, at least appearance-wise. Also, I'd like to give a brief shout-out for Mr. Jonathan Green, a long-time supporter of this channel. Alright, now that that's all out of the way, let us set sail to the unknown and discover what dreams may come. Why is it wrong to put a stop to one's own life? Why is it a sin to simply escape one's own suffering by fleeing into the hereafter? Is it so wrong to just run away from all the pain, even when there are really no options left? These are questions that constantly trouble me even when I was a child. I have always struggled with thoughts of simply shuffling off my mortal coil on my own. Simply living is a struggle all its own, if you ask me. This film, based on a novel by Richard Matheson, is something different though. It makes you wonder about the meaning and beauty of life. You don't need to be really religious to appreciate the story, and its message, while painful in some ways, comes with its own lessons. It's one of the few things I turn to when I feel conflicted and depressed, like right now. I just pray that things aren't as bad as some people say, and God, whom I have always believed in and loved, isn't as harsh a judge as some people say he is. But enough about me and how I feel about all this, eh? Anyway, as mentioned earlier, What Dreams May Come is a novel written by Richard Matheson and was later adapted to film by Vincent Ward and starred Robin Williams, Annabella Sciorra, Cuba Gooding Jr., and Max von Sydow. It tells the tale of a man named Chris Nielsen and his wife, Annie Collins, portrayed by Williams and Sciorra respectively. There's a lot of other important characters too, like their children and the people in heaven who help out later. One could say that Chris and Annie's romance couldn't be more perfect, especially with how they first met when their boats crashed into one another on a lake. From there, They are quick to bond and form a romance, with Chris especially falling for Annie's beautiful artwork. Indeed, while I am no expert when it comes to love or romance, I could say that rarely have I seen love portrayed so beautifully and ideally, since art is probably one of the best and purest ways to express one's affection for another. From this ideal love, though, things take a turn for the worst. In the film, Chris and Annie's children both die in a fatal traffic accident. This doesn't happen in the book. In fact, this becomes a bone of contention for a lot of fans of the book, but I digress. Anyway, it is from this that the couple's lives begin to take a downturn. This is largely because Annie allowed the children's nanny to drive instead of her. She believes that by not choosing to drive for her children, she inadvertently caused their deaths, and thus comes to blame herself for their demise. While equally devastated as his wife, Chris chooses to struggle alongside her so that she doesn't have to suffer alone. In an act of self-sacrifice Chris even decides to put together some paperwork that will allow Annie to divorce him if it turns out that he is making things more difficult for her. The couple come to call this incident the Double D anniversary, which stands for Decision for Divorce. However, 4 years after their children's death, in the film anyway, and their first Double D anniversary, Chris dies in another car accident, and this truly sends Annie into a deep, brooding depression. That said, Chris's soul remains, and as a friendly ghost of sorts, he does his best to cheer his wife up, even after he's passed on physically. Another spirit accompanies him though, one named Albert, portrayed by Cuba Gooding Jr., and he's told, repeatedly in fact, to move on to the afterlife. While he means well, trying to communicate with Annie will only hurt her more, according to Albert. And Chris does come to realize this when he notices that everything he tries to do to let her know that he still exists and that he will always be with her only leads her to more depression and questioning her own sanity. Reluctantly, he goes with Albert in the hopes that perhaps one day he can reunite with Annie in heaven. Albert then brings Chris to heaven, and the latter is left dumbfounded at the beauty and meaning of it all. He finds himself standing in a vast field of flowers, not unlike those painted by his wife Annie, and are actually made of paint. Albert then explains to him that this is because, in heaven, you can make your own world the way you want it to, and since he is deeply in love with his wife and her art, this causes his own corner of heaven to be much like her beloved paintings. Chris and Albert then go on to explore more of heaven and run into a woman who turns out to be Chris's long-lost daughter. Chris is surprised to see that she has changed into an Asian woman of all things. She explains to him that it was because she saw the Asian flight attendants on the plane they were on as the idea of perfection and idealism. She mentions him talking about Asian women and telling her how perfect and graceful they seemed to him, and that made her believe that they were almost angels of some kind. And since she entered heaven, she thought that that's what she would want to look like because she believed that's how angels would appear. Of course, this doesn't appear in the book because their children didn't die, but again, I'm digressing. After all this, Chris and Albert get to see other parts of heaven that are even more beautiful and marvelous. They see that some dwellers in heaven have even gone on to form cities by connecting their territories of heaven together. Albert also brings Chris to a library and explains to him that the goodness in heaven trickles down onto earth and into the dreams of artists, allowing them to create wonderful works of art. It is then hinted that the negativity of hell also rises to earth to affect the minds of the depressed and disturbed. Later, Chris and Albert realize that while Chris might have passed on, he is still bound to Annie through their thoughts and emotions. This is so strong, in fact, that she can still affect his part of heaven through her will alone. Albert then explains to Chris that this is the function of soulmates and that this is the kind of love that transcends even life. This brings joy to Chris's heart, but this is short-lived when it turns out that, even in the life after, tragedy can still occur. Chris then learns that Annie had taken her own life due to grief. To make matters worse, she has gone to hell for exactly that sin. Worst of all is that those who go to hell, due to ending themselves very rarely to the point of being impossible, leave that wretched realm. Angry, Chris asks why this has to be when heaven itself seems to be so ideal. Albert explains to him that this has nothing to do with heaven or rules, as some people would put it. It has more to do with the fact that people are trapped in hell because of their obsession with their own sins and unwillingness to accept the truth. People who end themselves become the worst of these, as they tend to delude themselves to the point that they become unreachable to anyone trying to help them or rescue them. Saddened but undeterred, Chris says that he still intends to look for his wife in hell and try to rescue her. While he is aware that most people think that it is impossible, he will at least try. It is here that Chris and Albert seek out a tracker, a spirit whose duty it is to seek out those who are trapped in hell and somehow try to rescue them. And this is where I will stop and let you see the film for yourself should it spark your interest. While I could spoil the ending for you, I think you'll appreciate it more should you decide to watch it. I don't want to go any further than that because I do think I've never seen a better end to a film. Now, anyone is going to tell you that I'm not much of a fan of romance or love stories, but this was one I'll admit I actually fell in love with and am not ashamed to say so. While the loss of actor Robin Williams was painful to a lot of his fans, this film has at least given me some degree of comfort. As for me, well, I really do hope that people who choose to leave the world of their own volition aren't beyond saving, as the book and film suggest. I pray fervently that God is a lot kinder than some people believe, and wouldn't judge people who have had to deal with so much already so cruelly. For there isn't a single day that I don't think of my late family and long to join them in the hereafter. They seem selfish to some, but I suppose they were all I really had. They were my life, though I was too foolish to realize it then. And that's it for this episode of Natural Juan. Natural Juan, out.